Well, after 20 years, the United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan, sparking questions about future United States involvement in the Middle East. Now, in a new report from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Matthew Petty and Trita Parsi argue that instability in the Middle East cannot be blamed on any sole actor and can be traced to expansionist states, U.S. partners, and to the U.S. itself.
They argue that the U.S. should do no harm and then help resolve tensions between its partners in the region, creating a new security structure. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, joins us now to discuss. Welcome, Trita.
Thank you so much for having me.
I mean, the traditional understanding of a Mideast policy from a conventional kind of American perspective is that everything would be cool if Iran would just leave everybody alone. And in fact, that's barely a simplification of the kind of the reigning analysis of the region. You looked into it. How did you attempt to quantify this, and what did you find?
So Matt Petty and I took a look at this question, and I think it's important to recognize it's not just Iran. I mean, every decade we have had our chosen boogeyman, whether it was Gaddafi in the 80s, then in the 90s, of course, it was Saddam Hussein. And, for a brief period, it was Assad in Syria and then back to Iran again. Reality is that we have had this simplistic approach to the region in which we have defined the problem in the region to be one bad actor who, of course, invariably is opposed to the United States. What we did is that we took a look at all of the interventions that countries in the Middle East have committed in the last 10 years to just see, is there much truth to this idea? Because if there was, the chosen country, the chosen boogeyman would be a complete outlier. It would be doing far more interventions than the others. The picture was dramatically different. First of all, Iran is an extremely interventionist country, one of the most interventionist countries in the region. There's no doubt about that. But so are almost all of the other major powers. The six countries we focused on are roughly equally interventionist. There's essentially two tiers, the top tier of Iran, Turkey, and the UAE, and the lower tier of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and in the middle you have Israel. But in the last couple of years, actually the Turks and the UAE and the Emiratis have been more interventionist than Iran. And 5 out of the 6 most interventionist countries in the region are armed and politically supported by the United States. That's a dramatically different picture than the rather simplistic view that we have had in Washington about the Middle East for the last 40 years.
Yeah, and the obvious question that this raises is what on earth is the solution? Because as you point out, everybody is an interventionist. Almost every major power has these interventionist instincts at this point. So how do you start to untangle the interventionist web that the Middle East certainly finds itself in and the world's major powers find itself in? Going forward, what should, say, policy from the United States be, given that, at this point, it's not as though you can just unwind the clock and take all of the interventionism away. You're working within that context.
Absolutely. And before we even get to that point, we have to recognize another very important reality, which is that it is not necessarily so that interventions drive stability. They do, but to a large extent, instability drives interventions, which means that, for instance, the biggest driver of interventions were actually the Arab Spring. When you had several Arab countries collapse, they created vacuums that sucked in these various countries, and they started doing interventions. Those interventions exasperated the instability in the region and were extremely unhelpful. But it was first the instability itself that came, then the interventions, and then the interventions fed more instability. If we first recognize that, then we have to conclude that one of the best things the United States can do is to make sure that we do our utmost not to pursue policies that actually increases the risk of state collapse, such as massive embargoes on countries that destroys the states. We have that on Iran right now. We have that on Syria. If those states completely collapse, in the case of Syria, to a large extent that's already happened, that will create a huge vacuum that will drive interventions, which in turn will drive further instability. So that's step one. Step two is recognizing that a lion's share of the instability and the interventions are actually taking place, are being conducted by allies of the United States or strategic partners of the United States. it actually provides an opportunity, because these are countries that the United States arguably has much more leverage over than a country like Iran, for instance, that is defined as an enemy of the United States, certainly defined by the Iranians themselves as an enemy of the United States. So there's a lot we can do, for instance, to make sure that the Emiratis and the Turks don't continue to destroy Libya, as is taking place right now, or that they don't fight with each other in other arenas in the region. We have more of a chance of being able to put a stop to that than we have when it comes to what the Iranians are doing. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try our utmost to stop what the Iranians are doing, but if we're only focusing on them and turning a complete blind eye to all of the instability and interventions that are taking place by allies of the United States that are actually at the same level of what the Iranians are doing, then we're really not going to do much about stability for the Middle East.
Isn't there a risk, though, that arguing that instability fuels interventions can be twisted to say, well, then therefore we need stability, therefore we need strong men, and so we need to support dictators like we always have done in the Middle East, and we need to get back robustly to that policy?
We addressed that in a previous report that we wrote, I think, about a year ago. And bottom line is, dictators ultimately will bring about instability because they will be pursuing policies to enhance their own power at the expense of the stability of the country. The type of extremism that we have seen in the Middle East can be tied to very, very harsh repression pursued by these dictatorships. So the idea that strongmen will keep the region stable and as a result nothing will happen is not a correct one. That is not what we're advocating for. But we're certainly also pointing out that the idea that we can turn countries into democracies by bombing them or invading them is equally false. In fact, there's very little that we have to recognize the U.S. can do. The U.S.'s ability to be able to make a lot of positive change is somewhat limited, and we have to have the humility of recognizing that and not pursue policies that are way beyond our capabilities. But within that, the first thing we can do is to make sure that we don't do any harm. And preventing or stop pursuing policies that actually fuel state collapse is step number one. Not invading new countries is step number two. Step number three is that when we have allies that we are arming, let's make sure they don't do bad things. And then, of course, within that, we should be addressing what the Iranians or other antagonists of the United States do. But again, if we're only focusing on them, then we are missing the larger part of the picture, and we will be unsuccessful.
And you and the Quincy Institute have been arguing pretty consistently that withdrawing from the Middle East would force these countries to work out their problems on their own. Are you seeing any evidence of that unfolding?
I think we're seeing some very interesting embryonic evidence of that dynamic being in play right now. Whether it will succeed or not depends on a whole set of factors. But what the Iraqis are doing right now, for instance, in terms of facilitating and moving towards mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is a clear example of that dynamic in which these countries recognize that it lies in their own interest to be able to resolve these issues. And when they cannot rely on the United States coming in and resolving their problems for them militarily, then the option of regional diplomacy becomes the optimal one and much more attractive one. And that is certainly the case for the Saudis. With Trump gone, with Biden administration clearly signaling that it's leaving Afghanistan, that it's seeking to leave Iraq as well, the Saudis have had a wake-up call. They realize now that they do have to pursue diplomacy with a whole host of regional actors, not just the Iranians, the Qataris and others as well. And that is something that we should be encouraging. That is a good thing. And we have to recognize that to the extent that we had massive amount of troops, 19 bases, 50 to 60,000 troops in the region, we actually disincentivized some countries from pursuing diplomacy because it was always easier and cheaper for them to have us resolve their problems for them.
Trita, I really like your step-by-step program there. It's like we can have a program for a step-by-step program for addicts to neoconservatism.
Yeah, just stop invading countries one day at a time.
The first step is accepting you have a problem. Trita, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really appreciate it. We'll be back with more Rising after this.